In this episode, we're going to focus on a part of security that many beginners overlook because it does not feel technical at first: documenting incidents clearly so the organization can meet regulatory expectations, contractual obligations, and executive decision needs. When an incident happens, people naturally want to jump straight into fixing the problem. But documentation is what turns a chaotic event into a controlled response that others can understand and trust. Clear documentation is also how you protect the organization and the people doing the work, because it shows what was known at the time and why certain choices were made. With AI systems, the details can be subtle and misunderstandings can spread quickly, especially when people are worried about privacy, safety, and reputation. By the end, you should understand what good incident documentation looks like, how to keep it accurate without being overly technical, and why different audiences need the same facts presented in different ways. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Incident documentation is the written record of what happened, what was done, and what is known, including what is still unknown. It is not a novel, and it is not a dumping ground of raw logs, but it is also not a vague summary that hides important details. Think of it as a structured narrative backed by evidence, where the story can be followed by someone who is not present. A beginner should remember that documentation has two jobs at the same time. It helps responders coordinate during the incident, and it creates a record for after the incident. During the incident, the record prevents confusion, duplicate work, and contradictory messages. After the incident, the record supports reporting requirements, supports legal and contractual decisions, and supports improvement work so the same failure pattern does not repeat. Regulators care about whether an organization protects sensitive data, manages risk responsibly, and responds in a timely and competent way when things go wrong. Contract partners care about whether your incident affects shared systems, shared data, or service commitments, and whether you followed the security promises written into agreements. Executives care about impact, options, trade-offs, and what decisions they need to make now, such as whether to pause a service, notify customers, or allocate resources for containment and recovery. All three audiences need the same underlying facts, but they need those facts framed differently. That is why clear documentation starts with getting the facts right and organizing them in a consistent way, rather than writing a different story for each audience. If you do not have a reliable internal record, external reporting becomes guesswork, and guesswork creates risk. A practical foundation for documentation is a timeline, because timelines reduce confusion and allow others to see cause and effect. A timeline should capture when the first signal occurred, when the incident was detected, when the incident was confirmed, what major actions were taken, and when the incident was contained and resolved, even if those times are approximate early on. With AI incidents, the timeline should also include changes to models, prompts, integrations, and data sources, because these changes often explain why behavior shifted. The key beginner idea is that timelines can be updated as you learn more, but you should start the timeline early rather than trying to reconstruct it later. Early timeline entries also show good faith, because they demonstrate that the team was tracking events while responding. A timeline is often the backbone of the entire incident record. Another foundation is scope, meaning what is affected and what is not affected, based on evidence. Scope includes which AI systems, which environments, which user groups, which data sources, and which downstream services are involved. In a stressful incident, people tend to overstate or understate scope, either to avoid panic or to avoid blame, but good documentation stays disciplined and evidence-based. If you are unsure, you document uncertainty clearly and state what evidence you have and what you are still checking. For example, you might know that a certain AI assistant produced an unsafe output for one user, but you may not yet know whether the same output occurred for others. You might know that a sensitive data pattern appeared in prompt logs, but you may not yet know whether it was sent outside the organization. Clear scope documentation prevents rumors from filling the gaps. A third foundation is classification, which is how you describe the nature and severity of the incident in a consistent way. Classification might include whether the incident involves confidentiality, integrity, or availability, and what level of potential harm exists. For AI systems, classification may also include whether the incident involves data leakage, misuse, policy bypass, model integrity compromise, drift leading to unsafe behavior, or downstream harm from incorrect outputs. The purpose is not to use fancy labels, but to help people understand what kind of problem this is and what playbook mindset applies. When documentation uses consistent classification language, it becomes easier to compare incidents over time and to show improvement. It also helps executives and regulators see that the organization treats incidents as a disciplined process, not as improvised crisis management. Now let's talk about how to document what happened in plain language without losing important technical truth. A good incident narrative explains the situation at a high level, describes the observed behavior, and then explains the likely cause and contributing factors as evidence supports them. For AI incidents, the narrative should describe what the system was designed to do and what it did instead, because that gap helps non-technical readers understand why it matters. For example, the system might be designed to summarize approved documents, but during the incident it summarized content that contained restricted personal data. Or the system might be designed to refuse certain requests, but during the incident it provided partial sensitive information in response to repeated prompts. The narrative should avoid speculation, and when it includes hypotheses, it should label them clearly as hypotheses. This keeps documentation credible and reduces the risk of later contradictions. Evidence handling is also part of documentation because readers will ask how you know what you claim. You do not usually paste full logs into an executive update, but you should record where evidence is stored, what sources were used, and what key data points support conclusions. In a regulator or contract context, you may need to demonstrate that evidence was preserved and that your conclusions are not based on hearsay. This is why documentation should include references to key artifacts such as prompt and response records, access logs, change histories, and downstream action records, even if those artifacts are stored separately. A beginner should think of the incident report as the map and the evidence artifacts as the terrain. The map should point to the terrain clearly so others can verify the route you took. Regulatory reporting often has timing requirements and specific content expectations, but even when exact formats vary, the same core topics tend to repeat. Regulators commonly care about what data was involved, how many individuals or records might be affected, what safeguards were in place, what failed, what was done to stop the harm, and what will be done to prevent recurrence. Contracts often care about similar topics, plus service availability, notification timelines, and responsibilities between parties. Executives care about impact to operations, impact to reputation, legal exposure, customer trust, and the resources needed for response and recovery. The good news for beginners is that if your internal documentation captures timeline, scope, classification, evidence, actions taken, and next steps, you already have most of what these external audiences need. The difference is how you summarize it and how you communicate uncertainty responsibly. Executive updates are a special kind of documentation because they happen during the incident, not just after. An executive update should be short, factual, and decision-oriented, meaning it highlights what happened, what the current impact is, what actions are underway, and what decisions are needed. The update should also include what is unknown and when the next update will occur, because uncertainty is normal in early stages. For AI incidents, executives often need to know whether any sensitive data was exposed, whether the system is still producing risky outputs, and whether shutting down or limiting the system is necessary. They also need to know whether users are being harmed in real time, such as receiving unsafe recommendations or incorrect decisions. Clear executive documentation prevents overreaction and underreaction by providing the best current picture and the reasoning behind recommended actions. It also creates a record of decisions, which matters later. Documentation for contracts often requires careful wording because it can affect obligations and liability. The goal is not to hide information, but to communicate accurately and within agreed boundaries, such as what must be disclosed and what must be verified first. Contract-focused documentation should clearly state whether shared data or shared services are implicated, what evidence supports that assessment, and what is being done to contain potential cross-party impact. For example, If an AI vendor system was involved, you might document how the vendor was notified and what information was requested from them. If a partner's data may have been exposed through prompts, you document the scope and the current confidence level. Beginners should learn that clear, disciplined documentation reduces misunderstanding and helps maintain trust with partners. Sloppy documentation creates confusion, disputes, and repeated follow-up that wastes time. A particularly important AI-specific documentation topic is explaining model behavior and system behavior in a way that is accurate but not overly detailed. Many people will assume the model is the entire system, but incidents often involve the surrounding application logic, data access, and policy enforcement layers. Documentation should clarify whether the issue was caused by a model output that was unsafe, a safety filter that failed, an integration that pulled in sensitive data, or an access control breakdown. It should also clarify whether the problem is reproducible and whether it is isolated to a specific model version or configuration. This clarity matters for regulators and executives because it affects confidence in containment. If you document that you rolled back a model update and the risky behavior stopped, that is different than documenting that the behavior is still occurring intermittently. As we close, remember that incident documentation is not an afterthought. It is part of the response itself, and it is one of the strongest tools you have for building trust. Clear documentation creates a reliable timeline, defines scope, classifies the incident consistently, and explains what happened in plain language supported by evidence. It enables regulatory reporting, contractual communication, and executive decision-making without contradictions and without panic. It also protects the response team by showing what was known at the time and why actions were taken. For AI incidents, disciplined documentation is especially important because systems are complex and public perception can be intense. When you learn to document clearly, you turn a stressful event into a defensible record and a source of learning, which is exactly what a mature security program needs.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.